from here on out, it is being recorded. All right, so again, it's being recorded from here. All right, so yeah, again, this is a review session for the final exam or the newest material since exam 2, chapters 13 and 14. As far as what the exam is going to cover, the exam covers chapters 1 through 3, 7 through 9, and 11 through 14. I remember we skipped chapters 4 through 6 and chapter 10 in the book. It is 41 multiple choice questions. Each question is worth 2 points. So you can miss one question and still get 80 out of 80, or you can get 82 out of 80 if you get all 41 questions correct. You're going to have 120 minutes or 2 hours to complete the exam, and you'll be taking it through iLearn just like your other exams on Friday, June 12th. So you'll be able to log into the exam anytime between 11:30 and 12:30, and then you will have 2 hours to complete it once the exam starts. So with that in mind, again, if you decide you want to start at 11:30, then you'll have till 1:30. If you decide that you want to start it at 12:30, then you'll have till 2:30. Right, so you'll have the 2 hours once you decide to start the test. Again, we just do that staggered start so that we don't crash the system when everybody logs in at the exact same time. And as of again last night, the exam is optional. You don't have to take it if you don't want to. If you choose not to take it, your grade will stick out of 320 points. If you do take it, then your grade will include your final exam score and be calculated out of 400 points. Either way, you will get the grade that correlates to the percentage of how many points you received out of the total possible that is on the syllabus. All right. Any questions on that much? Nope. All right. Remember that, again, it is optional, but if you do start the exam, then your exam will count. So don't start it unless you intend to complete it. Because how I'm going to judge whether or not your grades out of 320 or out of 400 will depend on whether or not you have a score for the test. All right, so here's how I'd study for this thing. If I were you, I'd go through your class notes. I'd check out the study guide and the review session slides, including maybe this video to help you organize your studying. You can study the old discussion session assignments. That might be a good place to start. Your old module and unit quizzes, your extra credit practice tests, including the extra credit practice final, which is due later in the week. Also, you have all those course book and practice questions. So you've got literally like hundreds of multiple choice questions that are going to be similar to the types of questions that you can see on the exam, but they won't be the exact same. So I wouldn't memorize the answers to questions, but rather I would make sure you understand why the right answers are the right answers and why the wrong answers are wrong answers when you're trying to study these questions here. Because again, you get questions that won't be the exact same, but they will be similar. And then finally, consult your textbook, your book PowerPoint slides, or come see me in my Zoom office hours if there's anything you don't understand, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So with that in mind, I'm going to be going over, again, the newest material since the last exam, so chapters, starting with chapter 13. Does anybody have any questions before I begin? Nope. If you don't have any questions, remember, try to mute your mic until you do have a question so that we can kind of limit that background noise. And again, I'll kind of ask you all if you have any questions as we go through each slide. If you have a question, you just feel free to let me know. All right. So starting off with chapter 13, make sure you know the 3 functions of money. Remember, money serves as a medium of exchange. Remember, that means that it's kind of something that can help facilitate transactions. Remember, in a world without money, you have to trade goods for other goods, which means you have to find somebody who wants what you have and somebody who has what you want. It's called the double coincidence of wants, and that's a pretty difficult thing to overcome, right? So again, money kind of helps more of those transactions happen more easily. Remember that money also serves as a store of value. You can keep money over time, and as long as you don't have hyperinflation, it will keep its value over time. That's not true of some goods and services like, say, oranges or apples, right? Those tend to rot over time. Also, it's a liquid asset that you can keep over time. So not only can you keep it over time and it'll keep its value, but you can also spend it either now or in the future pretty easily as you see fit. And then money serves as a unit of account, and we mean what we mean by that is a common denominator by which you can post prices or keep track of like revenues and profits and things like that. Remember in that lecture video, I said, in a world without money, how much is an apple worth? There's literally thousands of things that you could post in terms of trading for an apple, right? Whereas with money, we just post the price in terms of the dollar amount that the apple's worth. Then everybody else can figure out how much that's worth for them based off of that. Also, make sure you know the difference between M1 and M2, right? Remember that M1 is equal to the currency, which is the cash and coins that are out there, right? So, in the money supply, right? In addition to the currency, it's also equal to what is called checkable deposits for your checking account. So whatever money people have in their checking accounts, that would be included in there. And then also, it includes what are known as traveler's checks, which a lot of people don't really use anymore. It's kind of an antiquated thing, but I think there's still a few out there, right? There's basically checks that you can spend overseas. So again, this is kind of reflects what we call the medium of exchange function of money, and that you can spend money from these sources right away. So in other words, you pull out your debit card or a check to spend money from your checking account. You can pull out your cash and coins to spend money at a store right away, or you can pull out a traveler's check to do it. Sorry, I should say traveler's checks, not checks. So yeah, you can do all that pretty immediately, right? You don't have to convert it into anything else first. And then the M2 function of money is equal to everything that is included in M1. So everything here, your cash and coins, your checking accounts, your traveler's checks, but it includes that, but it also includes anything in your savings account. So any savings deposits. Also anything in what is called a small denomination time deposit. So it's like a financial CD. We have to keep money in that account for a certain period of time. So anything less than $100,000 in those kinds of accounts is included in M1 as well, or sorry, M2 as well. Plus your money market mutual fund, which again is a collective investment scheme where you pool your money with other people's money to buy these highly liquid securities. All right. So again, the difference between M1 and M2 is that M2 includes things that you can't spend from right away. Like you can't show somebody your savings statement and spend money from it right away. I'm sorry, does somebody have a question? Again, if you don't have a question, please try to mute your mic so that we can limit the background noise. Also, so know when a question is being asked.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it, Rebecca.
So there was a question in the quiz from last week, and it was on M1. And
okay.
There was like M1 is, and it was pick the answer. And I was very confused by the wording of some of the answers because I was thinking pretty much the straightforward currency plus checking accounts plus traveler's checks. So I forgot what the answers were that you could have opted in. But
the only other thing I could think of that I would ask in that capacity is that M1 would be, so say something like M1 would reflect, and the answer is that this is kind of the medium of exchange function of money.
Okay.
Right, because again, you can spend this money right away. Whereas M2 includes all that M1 stuff, but it also includes this stuff here, which is how you store money over time, right? So this is kind of the store of value function of money, right? So that'd be the big difference between M1. So an economist who cares more about like just the medium of exchange function of money might just focus on M1, whereas economists who would care more about that store of value function of money might focus on M2. Does that help answer the question?
Yes.
Cool, yep. You might have also seen a question like, what if somebody takes $1,000 out of their checking account and puts it in their savings account? How would that affect M1 and M2? Well, if you take $1,000 out of your checking account and put it into your savings account, that will cause M1 to go down by $1,000, but it will cause M2 to be unchanged. And the reason why it will cause M2 to be unchanged is because remember, M2 also includes M1. So if you take 1,000 out of checking and put into savings, you're just taking it from one part of that M2 and putting it into a different part of M2. So M1 would go down, but M2 would be unchanged. So those are the kinds of questions I might ask you there with regards to these different definitions for money supply.
Sorry, can you go over what you wrote? It's kind of hard to read. Under M2 that it's store of value
function of money.
Okay.
So I'm just repeating this part here. Right, yeah, so M2 again reflects that store of value function of money. Any other questions? Nope. All right. So let's continue on here. Understand how that fractional reserve banking system works. Remember that whatever money you put into a bank like Bank of America, that bank doesn't have to hold on to all of it. They're going to hold on to a small fraction of it and then loan out the rest, right? Now, whatever money they loan out, somebody can take that money and maybe put it into a different bank, right? And then that bank would only have to hold on to a fraction of that money, and then they can loan out the rest. And so that's kind of how banks create money or create that money multiplier. So know how to calculate the money multiplier and how that required reserve ratio affects the money supply. So remember, the money multiplier is equal to 1 over that required reserve ratio. So if the Fed sets a required reserve ratio of 20%, that means banks have to, by law, hold on to 20% of all deposits, right? So if you hold on to 20% of those deposits, let me do that, sorry, got a little off the rails here. All right, let's go back. Cool. All right. So if the bank holds on to 20% of those deposits, that'll be 1 over 0.20, and that's going to be equal to 5. So that's the size of the money multiplier, meaning that if the Fed injects, say, $1,000 into the economy, it could increase money supply by as much as $5,000 worth, right? If, again, that money multiplier is as big as it possibly could be, right? Now, if the Fed wanted to reduce money supply, then it could increase the amount of money that banks have to hold or increase that required reserve ratio. So they said that banks now have to hold on to, say, 50% of all deposits, and that'd be 1 over 0.50, right? And that's equal to 2, right? So again, that makes for a smaller multiplier, and that means money supply won't increase as much. So if the Fed injects $1,000 into the economy, then you could have as much as $2,000 being created. If the Fed wanted to use expansionary monetary policy to increase the money supply, then again, it would lower those reserve requirements. Say banks only have to hold on to 10% of deposits. So if you put $1,000 in Bank of America, they only have to hold on to 100. They can loan out the other 900. That'll give you a money multiplier of 10, meaning that $1,000 injection into the economy could create as much as $10,000 worth of money supply. Right. So again, one of the ways that the Fed controls the money supply is by manipulating that that reserve requirement ratio. Right. So make sure you know how that works and how that's related to that money multiplier. Right. Are there any questions on this much? Everybody understands how that works? Cool. All right, now remember, the banks don't necessarily have to loan out all the money that they can. They can hold on to extra money, or what's called excess reserves. They can either keep that in their vaults or deposit it with the Fed, right? Also, people don't necessarily have to put all the money in the bank. They could keep some of it in there, like under their mattress or whatever. And those are things that will limit the potential size of that multiplier, right? Or make that multiplier not as big as it otherwise could be. Looks like we had a question in the chat. Somebody says, just a little confused. What part? Are you confused about how the multiplier and reserve required ratio works?
Yeah, just, I guess something that what you just kind of mentioned. I just really need a little grasp idea. That's it, and all, So yeah.
So, all right. So I guess the idea here is that, let's say, we'll start here at the beginning. So let's say that you put $1,000 in Bank of America and the required reserve ratio is 20%. That means that the bank has to, by law, hold on to 200 of that $1,000 in case you want some of your money back. But then they can loan out, say, $800, and that's going to be spent and end up in another bank somewhere. And then they have to hold on to 20% of that, and they can loan out the rest, right? Rather than go through that until there's no more money to be loaned out, you can just use this equation, 1 over the required reserve ratio. And if you do that, and the required reserve ratio is 20%, that gives you this number 5. That's the size of the potential deposit expansion money multiplier, or sometimes called the money multiplier. And basically all that means is that after that $1,000 gets lent out and put into different banks, it can create as much as $5,000 worth of money supply. Because again, banks are recording the amount of money that's put in there, and then they're loaning some of that money out, and as if they still have it, but they don't. And that's going to end up in other banks, which they're going to record that. And if you want to increase the size of the money multiplier, then you got to lower the required reserve ratio. If you want to decrease the size of the money multiplier, then you're going to increase the required reserve ratio. And so one way that the Fed controls money supply is by affecting this money multiplier by changing this required reserve ratio. Remember, the Federal Reserve is kind of that central bank that sets all these rules and regulations. All right, so hopefully that helps clear things up. Any questions on that? Nope. All right, so let's move on here. With that in mind, remember we talked about the 4 ways in which the Fed conducts monetary policy, right? So there's both expansionary and restrictive policy. Expansionary policy is increasing money supply. The restrictive policy is decreasing the money supply, right? So if the Fed wants to use open market operations, remember that's just the buying and selling of bonds. Remember that they're going to buy bonds to increase the money supply, and they're going to sell bonds to reduce it. If they buy bonds, that's them injecting cash into the economy by taking out those bonds or pieces of paper. If they're trying to slow down the money supply, then they're going to sell bonds or take cash out of the economy as they give people those pieces of paper. And then the other, the second thing is those reserve requirements we just talked about. Remember that if we lower the reserve requirements, then we're going to increase the size of that money multiplier, and that's going to increase money supply. If we raise those reserve requirements, then we're going to lower the size of that money multiplier, and that's going to restrict money supply. The third way that they control money supply is through the extension of loans. So if you want a loan, you got to take out a loan from, say, Bank of America. If Bank of America wants a loan, then they have to go to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve will charge them an interest rate for taking out a loan in the same way that Bank of America charges you an interest rate for taking out a loan. And the rate that the Fed charges Bank of America is called the discount rate. So in the same way that you might be more eager to borrow money when interest rates are lower, Bank of America is going to be more eager to borrow money when the discount rate is lower. So if the Fed wants Bank of America to increase the money supply, then they'll lower the discount rate, and that will cause Bank of America to want more loans from the Fed. So the Fed will extend more loans to them, and they're going to go ahead and loan out that money, and that will increase money supply. Now, if the Fed wants to reduce money supply, then it might raise the discount rate, and by raising that discount rate, make it more expensive for Bank of America to borrow money. So Bank of America will be less eager to get those loans, so the Fed will extend less loans to them. And then finally, we have this interest paid on excess reserves, right? So the Fed will also give the Bank of America interest on any deposits Bank of America has with the Fed, in the same way that you earn interest on your savings account if you have a savings account with Bank of America, right? So if the Fed wants Bank of America to loan out money and not deposit it with the Fed, then they'll reduce the interest paid on those excess reserves, right? Again, at a lower interest rate that they'll receive, then they'll be less eager to deposit money with the Fed. They'll be more eager to loan it out instead. But if the Fed wants the bank to hold on to this money and not loan it out, then they're going to increase the interest paid on excess reserves. That'll encourage Bank of America to deposit more money with the Fed and loan out less money to the public. And that's how they'll restrict money supply there, right? So that's the 4 ways the Fed conducts monetary policy and how they do it. Are there any questions about this chart here? Oh, no questions? All right. So let's go ahead and try a few practice questions and make sure we can do it. So this first one says, a commercial bank has $1 million of customer checkable deposits and actual reserves of 300,000. If the reserve ratio is 20%, what is the maximum amount of new loans that the bank can extend? Right. So again, they have $300,000 of the $1 million sitting there in the bank, and the reserve ratio is 20%. So what is the amount of new loans that they can extend given this information? Right. So you can either type out your answer in the chat, or somebody wants to shout it out when they know. We can do it that way too, since there's only about 6 people in here. With that in mind, again, you can submit your answers through the chat or shout it out, whatever you prefer to do. All right, we got a few people saying B. Nobody else saying anything different, right? Well, B is the answer you're looking for, right? Again, if the bank has to hold on to 20% of that $2 million, then they have to hold on to $200,000 by law. If they're sitting on $300,000, that means they have $100,000 in excess reserves, and that $100,000 is the amount that they are legally allowed to loan out, given that information, right? So that's kind of how you calculate it, figure out what's the amount that they have to hold on to based on the reserve ratio and their total deposits, and then figure out from that how much they're allowed to loan out based on how much they're currently holding. Any questions at all about this question or how to do it? Anybody see where that comes from? Cool. All right, let's try another practice question here. So this one says, which of the following would cause the money supply in the United States to decrease? So if the Fed wanted to decrease the money supply or use that restrictive monetary policy, which of these would they do? So again, take a minute to answer that there. Again, you can throw out the answer in the chat if you prefer. Trying to not cover up the words. All right. So it looks like a lot of people are choosing A, and A is the correct answer here. All right. It's going to be an increase in reserve requirements. If banks have to hold on to more money, that means that they can loan out less. Oops, sorry, I didn't do that. It went a little too fast. Cool. There we go. Going back to it. So yeah, that means that the bank is going to the Fed is going to increase reserve requirements, and that will lower the size of the multiplier, right? It's not a decrease in the discount rate. Remember, a decrease in the discount rate will increase money supply, not decrease it. Same thing, purchase of bonds by the federal government will also increase money supply and not decrease it. An increase in the world supply of gold won't necessarily affect the money supply one way or another by itself, right? So again, A is the answer you're looking for on this one, right? Any questions on this? Or why it's A? No, we're good. All right, so that's chapter 13. So we're kind of halfway through it here in terms of covering these chapters. Let's get into chapter 14. All right, make sure you know how the money market works, right? Remember that the price of money is the nominal interest rate, and the quantity in this market is just called the quantity of money. And we're talking about, when we talk about the quantity of money, we're talking about the quantity of money that people want to hold on their actual physical person. So in other words, money that they want to keep in their wallet or their purse or under their mattress, just anywhere but their bank account. So know why the curves are sloped the way they are. The money demand curve is downward sloping because at higher nominal interest rates, you'll be more likely to put your money in your savings account and less likely to put it under your mattress. At lower nominal interest rates, there's not as big of an opportunity cost of keeping your money out of the bank, so you might be more likely to put it under your mattress rather than in your bank account. And then the money supply curve is vertical because that is dependent completely on wherever the Federal Reserve sets it. In other words, it doesn't depend on the nominal interest rate at all. It's just wherever, again, the Federal Reserve says it is, right? So they set that money supply curve. And then equilibrium in the money market is, of course, where money demand intersects money supply. And then know how the Fed affects the money market through monetary policy. Remember, expansionary monetary policy will shift money supply to the right, and that will lower the interest rate. Restrictive monetary policy will shift money supply to the left, and that will raise interest rate. Now, we're about to go ahead and graph this out here, but before we do, are there any questions about these ideas before we get into the graph? Nope, no questions. All right, if there are no questions, let's go ahead and graph it out. Make sure we understand what's going on here. I'm going to exit the full screen mode just because it's easier to draw graphs from this mode here, right? So again, we're going to draw a money market. So we got a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. Remember, on the vertical axis, we're looking at nominal interest rates. And on the horizontal axis, we're talking about the quantity of money, right? Now remember, we're going to have a downward sloping money demand curve. So this is our demand for money. And again, know why it's downward sloping. High interest rates, you're going to be more likely to put money in the bank and less likely to hold it. At lower interest rates, you're going to be more likely to hold it and less likely to put it in the bank. And then you're going to have a vertical supply curve that looks like this. This is going to be the supply of money, and this is just wherever the Fed sets that money supply. And where the two intersect, that's going to give you the equilibrium quantity of money. Right, so we'll call this QM1 star, and then the equilibrium nominal interest rate, which we're just going to call I star, right? Go ahead and call that I1. All right. Now, the Fed can do one of two things. They can either increase the money supply or they can decrease it, or I guess they could just leave it where it is. Now, remember, the Fed could use expansionary monetary policy to increase that money supply. Remember that when the Fed uses that expansionary monetary policy, then that money supply is, when it increases, is going to shift that supply curve to the right. So that hasn't changed at all. All increases are shifts to the right. All decreases are shifts to the left. So if the Fed wants to use any one of these four tools of expansionary policy, right, they purchase government bonds, they lower reserve requirements, they lower the discount rate, or they reduce the interest paid on excess reserves, right? Any one of those four things is going to cause the money supply to increase or shift this curve to the right. So we'll call this supply of money 2. And that's going to give us a new equilibrium. Here, that's going to give us a new nominal interest rate that is going to be lower. So we'll call this I2 star. Right. So again, this is one way that the Fed can kind of affect interest rates, right, by increasing that supply of money. Now, if the Fed thinks that maybe we're having too much inflation, or they're worried about some kind of bubble that could burst later on, and they might want to use restrictive monetary policy. Remember, that means either selling government bonds, raising those reserve requirements, raising the discount rate so they extend less loans, or increasing the interest paid on excess reserves. So any one of those four tools the Fed can use to decrease the money supply. And when the Fed decreases the money supply, that's going to cause that supply of money to shift to the left. You know, all decreases are shifts to the left. Right, and so when we do that, you're going to reduce the quantity of money, and you're going to cause the nominal interest rate to go up in this case. Let's call that I3 star. All right, are there any questions at all about how this graph works? Everybody's with me on that? Cool. All right. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and move on. So let's talk a little bit about how this affects aggregate demand, right? So
question.
Oh, hold up, we do have a question. What's up?
Yeah, sorry, it's very quick. So like, let's say in the test, would there be a question with a graph like this saying, like, I don't know, the Fed decided to like increase interest rate, like the discount rate, or decrease the discount rate? Would you like ask us which one?
Yeah, I mean, that could be a potential question on the exam. So I could give you a graph like this and say, hey, the Fed decides to purchase government bonds. And if the Fed decides to purchase government bonds, then you need to figure out, does that make their supply of money go down or up? And then how's that going to affect the nominal interest rate based off of this graph? So you, yeah, I mean, that could be a potential question I could ask you.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Any other questions before we move on here? Nope. All right. So moving into chapter 14 here, know how monetary policy affects aggregate demand. So again, one of the Fed's jobs is to make sure that we are keeping the economy at full employment. So if we're in a recession, then we might want to increase money supply to help pull the economy out of a recession, because increasing money supply will increase aggregate demand. If the economy is in expansion, we might want to reduce money supply, again, to keep inflation in check, because decreasing money supply will reduce aggregate demand. Right, so with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about how a change in money supply will affect this aggregate demand. So expansionary monetary policy can increase aggregate demand through those lower interest rates. So again, going back to this graph, if we use expansionary monetary policy, then what we are doing is we're increasing the supply of money, which is going to cause those interest rates to go down. And those interest rates are going to go down. Those interest rates going down are going to cause aggregate demand to increase for these three reasons, right? One of which is that, remember that real interest rate is equal to nominal interest rate minus inflation. All else constant, if your nominal interest rate is going down, right, then that's going to cause your real interest rate to also go down. Now, remember that when real interest rate goes down, that means that you're going to be more likely to spend money rather than put it in the bank, so consumption is going to go up. You're also going to be more likely to borrow money at these lower interest rates. That's going to make investment go up, right? So both those things are going to cause aggregate demand to increase, right? Also, when interest rates go down, that means that people are going to be less likely to put money in U.S. banks and businesses. So people over in Europe or China or wherever, they're going to be less eager to put money in a U.S. bank when they get that lower interest rate of return. So that's going to cause capital inflows to decrease. So when capital inflows decreases, then that's going to cause the dollar, the U.S. dollar, to depreciate. And when the U.S. dollar depreciates, that's going to cause our net exports to go up. Remember, net exports is equal to exports minus imports. And if the dollar depreciates, that means that people in other countries are going to find U.S. goods relatively cheaper. So they're going to be more likely to buy those U.S. goods. So that's going to cause those exports to go up. At the same time, people in the United States are going to find goods produced over in Europe relatively more expensive because their dollar doesn't buy as many euros. So that's going to cause imports to go down, right? And that's why net exports is going to go up. And that's going to increase aggregate demand, at least for U.S. goods. And then thirdly, we have asset prices tend to increase. Remember, that includes like assets might be like the value of your home or the value of your stock portfolio. And when people's home is worth more, or when their stocks are worth more, then they're more optimistic about their economic standing, and they might be more likely to go out there and buy stuff, right? So that will also increase aggregate demand. Right, so those are ways in which the Fed can try to stimulate aggregate demand while lowering those interest rates through expansionary monetary policy. Right, now if the Fed wanted to use restrictive monetary policy, right, it could decrease aggregate demand, right, through all the opposite channels. So if you restrict monetary policy, then you are actually going to be lowering the money supply or shifting that money supply to the left, and that's going to cause that nominal interest rate to go up. When nominal interest rates go up, then it causes all these opposite things to happen, right? So this is the same stuff, just in the opposite direction. So all else constant, if nominal interest rates are going up, then that's going to mean that the real interest rate is going to go up. And when real interest rate goes up, then that means that people are going to be more eager to put money in the bank or save it rather than spend it. So consumption is going to go down. Also, people will be less likely to borrow money to invest if, again, they have to pay back that higher interest rate. So investment's going to go down, and that's going to reduce aggregate demand. Also, those capital inflows are going to go up because now people from other countries are going to be more eager to put money in, say, U.S. banks and businesses if they can get that higher rate of return through that higher interest rate. And that's going to cause the dollar to appreciate. That's going to make U.S. goods now more expensive to foreigners, so we're going to be exporting less. Also, it's going to make foreign goods cheaper for U.S. citizens, so U.S. citizens are going to be buying goods from other countries more, and that's going to cause net exports to go down. And again, these higher interest rates are going to cause your asset prices to decrease, so the value of your home or potentially the value of your stock portfolio might go down, and as a result, you might be a little bit more pessimistic about the future of the economy, so that might reduce aggregate demand. All right. Any questions at all about how this monetary policy affects aggregate demand? Nope. All right, so now again, know the different channels through which this works. Okay. Also, know the effects of monetary policy in both the short run and the long run, right? So remember that if the economy is in a recession, expansionary monetary policy will temporarily increase real GDP or reduce unemployment, right? So it can help pull the economy out of recession and get us back to full employment, albeit with maybe some higher prices. But if the economy is in long run equilibrium already, right? And then that's going to create a short-run expansion or temporary bubble, right? That again will have higher GDP and lower unemployment for the short run, but in the long run, only have higher prices as the economy moves back towards long-run equilibrium, right? So in other words, it's only going to create inflation in the long run, which is why the Fed has to be very carefully, Fed has to move very carefully when it decides how much it wants to increase the money supply. Because remember, too much inflation is definitely a bad thing. Now, restrictive monetary policy can again help bring us down from an inflationary boom. So that if the economy is in an expansion, right, again, it can restore the economy to full employment, albeit with maybe some lower prices or deflation, right? Because in the short run, right, a restrictive monetary policy can lower GDP and create higher unemployment, which again means that we have to be careful about how we time it, because if we're already in long-run equilibrium and we use restrictive monetary policy, then it will create a recession that wouldn't have otherwise existed, right? And then again, lead to deflation in the long run. So in order for this stuff to work well, you do have to time it right. And unfortunately, monetary policy suffers from all those same timing lags. Remember the recognition lag, we have to know when the economy is headed towards the recession or expansion, and it's hard for us to predict that. Now, the administrators of the Fed have to decide how much they want to increase or decrease money supply. That's not something that they do overnight. And then these changes have to impact the economy, right? It takes a while for money to work its way through the system and create that multiplier effect. So by the time this stuff actually works, it could have actually been mistimed in such a way to create more instability rather than stability. In other words, the expansionary monetary policy might hit at a period of time when we're not in a recession, right, creating a bubble, or that restrictive monetary policy might hit at a time when we're not in expansion, creating a bust. Right. Any questions on that? Nope. All right. Oh, see a question in the chat. Oh, somebody has to head out. That's okay. This is completely optional. You don't have to stick around if you don't want to, or if you got other obligations. Feel free to leave. But I'm glad it's been helpful so far. Okay. Any other questions or comments before we move forward? All right. We're actually almost done. We just got a few things left. So one of which is to do these practice questions. Right, so an unanticipated shift to a more expansionary monetary policy by the Fed will. So again, if the Fed is going to use expansionary monetary policy, how will that affect the economy based on what we just talked about? So again, I can give you all a second if you want to type out your answers in the chat. But again, you might want to go back to that graph and figure out what happens when the Fed increases money supply. Nobody yet? All right. Well, let's go through it together. First of all, if the Fed increases money supply, how is that going to affect the interest rates? Is that going to make interest rates go up or down? One increase in money supply, that's going to shift that supply of money to the right. Is it going to make those interests go down? Somebody says, yep. If interest goes down, then first of all, we know that the answer is not A or C here, which says that interest rates are going to go up. So we know that's going to reduce these real interest rates. Now, and reducing these real interest rates, is that going to lead to an appreciation or depreciation of the dollar? And the answer here is depreciation. So this part of this particular answer choice is incorrect, right? And so by reducing real interest rates, right, again, that's going to lead to a depreciation of the dollar. That's going to lead to an expansion in exports, not an appreciation. So the answer we're looking for here is D. Reducing real interest rates means that people are going to be more eager to borrow money and more eager to spend money, right, rather than put it in the bank, and that's going to cause aggregate demand to increase in the short run, right? So D is the answer you're looking for there. Any questions on that before we continue on? No. So again, that's how I'd go through these practice questions, is look at why the wrong answers are wrong and why the right answer is right. All right, so this one says the short-run impact of an unanticipated shift to a more restrictive monetary policy is most likely to be a reduction in. So what is going to happen in the short run when we use restrictive monetary policy? right? So that's the question being asked here. All right, let's give you all a minute to see if you can come up with it. All right, well, let's go through it. So remember that if we have a short run, if we have a restrictive monetary policy, that's going to cause the money supply to go down or interest rates to go up, and that's going to reduce aggregate demand or make it go down. Now, in the short run, the thing that's going to happen is you're going to see a reduction in real output. So C is the answer that you're really looking for here, right? When you have a reduction in real output or real GDP going down, that means that unemployment is actually going to go up, not down. So it's not going to lead to a reduction in unemployment. It's going to lead to increased unemployment, right? So that's why B isn't the answer here, right? Will lead to a reduction in prices, but it will also lead to a reduction in real output, which is why A is not the right answer, right? And remember, monetary policy doesn't affect budget deficit. Fiscal policy does that, right? And we're not talking about fiscal policy here. We're talking about monetary policy. So that's why C is the answer you're looking for. Okay, so has everybody got that? All right, let's go ahead and continue on. Right, so here in chapter 14, we also talked a little bit about some economic history. So know the reasons why the Great Depression was so long and severe, and one of which is because we had poorly timed monetary policy. Remember that we had these roaring 1920s that was one of the biggest times of economic growth in this country. So the Fed was really worried about inflation, about the economy growing too quickly. So they started using restrictive monetary policy. Unfortunately, though, by the time they started using it, the economy was already starting to collapse. So that restrictive monetary policy really took hold both immediately before as well as after that stock market crash, right? And so what happened was the restrictive policy ended up hitting the economy at a time when we were already headed towards that recession, making that recession longer and deeper. At the same time that that was happening, we also had the Smoot-Hawley tariff, right? Remember that the Smoot-Hawley tariff is the idea that we impose the greatest trade restriction in U.S. history, increasing taxes by 50% on all kinds of imported items. Countries responded with retaliatory tariffs of their own, and as a result, trade decreased by more than 50%. At the same time that that happened, we also had these huge tax increases where we increased the top marginal tax rate from 25% all the way up to 79%, meaning that if you were going to, say, create a factory that was going to employ people before, you got to keep 75 cents out of every dollar before the tax increase. But after this tax increase, you only got to keep 21 cents out of every additional dollar you earn. So people were less likely to take the risk or take the chance of starting factories. And again, that's when unemployment got as high as 25%. And you also had some crazy price controls, regulations, and constant policy changes. Remember, we talked about the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which took taxpayer dollars to pay farmers to destroy livestock and food at a time when people needed food the most in an effort to try to raise those farm prices. And of course, that wasn't a good policy. You don't want to destroy food at a time when people are starving to death in order to raise the price of food at a time when people don't have any money. And then we talked about the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was a policy that says that businesses you now are no longer allowed to compete with one another. You have to operate according to the same principles in terms of what price to charge, how much to produce, essentially forming companies to work together to act like big monopolies as opposed to allowing them to compete. And that caused production to go way down. In fact, it never recovered past its pre-NIRA level until after this was declared unconstitutional. Right. So again, these are things that made the economy worse during this time period. Any questions about the Great Depression or why it was so long and severe? Nope. All right. And then the last thing we talked about were the causes of the economic crisis of 2008, which I believe everybody in this class has lived through. So this is kind of considered by many to be the second worst economic time in this country's history, although that could be debatable. There's some pretty bad times in the 70s as well. But in any case, know the causes of the economic crisis of 2008. Remember that we had these regulations that lowered mortgage lending standards. So the government told their government-sponsored enterprises, we want you to get more poor people in the homes, so we want you to extend more loans to people below a certain income level. And in order to meet those targets, the only way they could do it was extend loans to people who they wouldn't otherwise extend loans to. And these are people with little to no down payment and bad and incomplete credit histories. So that drastically increased what are called subprime loans, which again, loans to people who have bad credit histories, or Alt-A loans, which are loans to people who have incomplete or missing credit histories. And both those loans are considered far more risky than what are known as prime loans, right? Now, at the same time that that was happening, the Federal Reserve was keeping interest rates artificially low in an effort to help try to pull the economy out of a recession caused by the September 11th terrorist attacks in 2001. And unfortunately, that low interest rate policy of the Fed encouraged people to buy what are known as adjustable rate mortgages, which are riskier mortgages that have low payments when interests are low, but much higher payments when interest rates are higher. Right. So again, these poor people with no down payment and bad credit histories are now thinking I can afford a much bigger house than I otherwise could if I get these adjustable rate mortgages. And so they bought those. And then the Fed ended up increasing interest rates because they're worried about inflation around 2005, 2006. And that caused the payments on these homes to go way up, so much so that these poor people in these homes could no longer afford it. And that's when they started to have them default on their mortgage loans, right? Now, at the same time that all that was happening, you had this increased debt to capital ratio of lending institutions, right? Remember that there's a certain amount that banks have to hold on to by law to make sure they don't leverage themselves too highly, and the rest they can loan out. Well, again, the Security and Exchange Commission said, here's what we're going to do because we want to kind of help the government meet their goals of getting poor people in the homes, right? Instead of holding on to 8% of deposits, which was the rule before, if you make housing loans, then you only have to hold on to 4% of those deposits, and you can loan out the other 96% of the money that's deposited with your bank. And if you can bundle these loans together in what's called a AAA mortgage-backed security, then you only have to hold on to 1.6% of your deposits. You can loan out the other 98.4%. Now, again, the banks make money by extending loans, not by holding on to it. So if you give them a reason to loan out more money, then they'll definitely loan out more money. So they started to pour all of their money into these mortgage-backed securities, which are usually safe, except remember we had number one, right? We had these lower lending standards that made these loans far less safe, right? And so again, when these loans started to default, right, and all these lending institutions like Goldman Sachs or AIG, they had all their money stuck into these mortgage-backed securities, right? Those started to fail, and these banks started to fail. Now, at the same time that that's happening, you also have this increased consumer culture that says that, hey, we don't need to save as much. In fact, we're okay having a lot more debt. So you saw a high and growing debt-to-income ratio of American households. That's what causes them to buy houses that are probably bigger than what they could normally afford. And then people tend to concentrate most of their debt in their home because the debt in their home is tax deductible, whereas other forms of debt are not, right? So again, it caused people to become highly leveraged in their house. And so when the housing market collapsed, then of course they're in a much worse way financially or economically speaking, right? Any questions about these four things that happened kind of around the same time period that create a perfect storm for a economic bubble and then burst? Nope, we're good. All right, well, if there's no questions on any of that, I believe that is all that I have prepared for you except for these last couple practice questions. So let's go through those and make sure that you can answer them. So this one says that most economists believe the severity and duration of the Great Depression was at least partially the result of. Let's see if you can answer that question here. All right, a few people are answering. The correct answer here is indeed D. We had a sharp, sorry about that. We had a sharp contraction of the money supply. Go back, slide or two. So we did have a sharp contraction of the money supply around this time period. In fact, that contraction hit right around the same time that the economy started to go down the tank there, right? It wasn't the excessive use of credit cards. Credit cards didn't even exist during the Great Depression, at least not in the way that we know them today, right? And it wasn't large budget deficits of the federal government at that time. In fact, the government actually did a pretty good job of balancing the budget. And it certainly wasn't a reduction in tariffs, right? If anything, we had the biggest tariff during the country's history during this time. So D is the answer you're looking for there. All right, now let's check out this last question. It says, adjustable rate mortgages became increasingly attractive and grew as a percentage of total outstanding mortgages during 2002 to 2004 because, which one of these did we talk about just now? So see if you can take a minute or so to answer that question. All right, we got some answers coming in. The correct answer is indeed A. Remember that interest rates were kept low during this time period, right? Due to, again, sorry about that. Due to that recession that we were trying to combat as a result of those terrorist attacks. And that's what encouraged people to get those adjustable rate mortgages where the payments are low when interest rates are low, right? Now, interest rates actually rose sharply following this period, but not during this period, right? So it's not B. Remember, lending standards weren't tightened during this period. In fact, they were loosened, right? And housing prices were actually soaring from 2001 through 2006, right? Only started to decline after the collapse during this time period. So A is the answer you're looking for during this for this question. All right. So again, that is all that I have prepared for you. Does anybody have any final questions on chapters 13 or 14 or anything else in the class before we go ahead and call it a day as far as this review session is concerned?
Should we study the reasons why there were these times that were with economical problems, because you'll give us examples of situations?
So these last two questions that I just asked you all, these practice questions, are questions that could appear on the exam, or at least questions that are similar to it. So I definitely study this information so that you can answer questions like that. Does that help?
Yes.
Cool. All right. Are there any other questions here? I got some questions in the chat. Real output is indeed real GDP, or just GDP adjusted for inflation. So that is correct. Somebody asked me, are we going to send the recorded video later? I will post the link to this video up on iLearn for you. So if you go into the folder labeled review sessions, you'll see both a link to the pre-recorded video that doesn't include Joel's questions, and then a link to this video that will include Joel's questions. So yeah, you'll be able to find a link to this video there, assuming that it gets uploaded to YouTube okay. If there's any technical issues, we might just have the pre-recorded video. I think we should be okay so far. Any other questions? All right, if there are no questions, then I guess that's it. Hopefully you found this review session helpful. And again, good luck on the exam on Friday. Make sure you finish the assignments in Module 10. Those are still required. If you decide you do not want to take the test after senior grade, then you can go ahead and choose not to take it, right? It is optional. But if you do want to take it, then again, just study the kind of stuff that's in the study guide or these review session videos, and I think you'll be okay for the test. All right, I think everybody's left, so that is the end of the review. I'm going to stop the recording. Again, for anybody who's watching this later, happy studying and good luck on the exam.